I can't get past the same sentence. In this case, it's the protagonist, who for 15 years is stuck on the first sentence of an experiment he's been trying to record for 20. He simply cannot write it down. Suddenly he manages to sit down and in one go, the way one might dream or imagine it, he writes down the results of his experiment. He has, however, only dreamt it. Suddenly his wife enters the room and discovers it. "You've written it all down behind my back. Outrageous!" She grabs the papers from his hands and burns the stack of them. Then he hears her say, "Now you can struggle with that sentence for another 20 years and start all over again." Two serviceable schools, naturally. Loneliness, apartness, remoteness on the one hand, then continuous mistrust on the other, arising out of loneliness, apartness, remoteness. And that was when I was still just a child. You're alone. You can only ever develop when you're alone. You're always alone. You're conscious of the fact that you can't come up with anything on your own. Everything else is a delusion, dubious. Nothing ever changes. In your years of study, you are completely alone. You have a benchmate at school, you are alone. You talk to other people, you are alone. You have opinions, other people's opinions, your own opinions. You are always alone. And when you write a book, or books if you're like me, you are even more alone. The people that came before me, my ancestors, were marvelous human beings. It is certainly no accident that I'm suddenly thinking of them on this ice-cold rock. They were everything at one time or another. Filthy rich, dirt poor, criminals, monsters. Almost all of them were perverse in some way. Happy, well-traveled. Most of them at some point suddenly up and killed themselves. And especially the ones who everyone assumed would never terminate their lives with a gunshot or a jump. One of them jumped into a light shaft. Another one put a bullet in his head. A third simply drove his car into the river. To think back on all these people is as horrible as it is pleasant. It's like when you're sitting in a theater as the curtain rises, and right away the people that you see up on stage are divided into the good and the bad. Not only into good and bad characters, but rather into good and bad actors. And I must say, it's an absolute delight to watch this play from time to time. Time after time. Time after time. Time after time. Time after time. The difficult thing is getting started. For a stupid person, it isn't difficult at all. He doesn't even know what difficulty is. He makes children, or makes books. He makes one child, one book, child after child, book after book. He's quite indifferent to everything. He doesn't even think about it. The stupid person doesn't know what difficulty is. He gets up, washes, steps out into the street, gets run over, is squashed to a pulp, and it's all the same to him. When you're alone for a long time, when you've gotten used to being alone, when you're schooled in loneliness, you discover more and more things in all the places where for normal people there's nothing. On the wall you discover cracks, irregularities, bugs. There's enormous movement on the wall. There's absolutely no difference between walls and the pages of a book. Basically, I would like nothing more than to be left in peace. And with the passage of time, I've ceased even to be interested in changes in the outside world. Of course, they're always the same thing over and over. Other people will have to deal with that. I'm only interested in my own procedures, and I can be quite ruthless. And it's all the same, whether I'm in my farmhouse or in some city, whether everything is falling to pieces around me or getting even more ridiculous than it already is or not. I find all of that quite meaningless. And it doesn't get me any closer or any place else that I haven't already been to. At the very least, it brings me closer to myself. And once I'm there, anything that's done well, that's beautiful, grows more and more questionable. So you've got to break off at the most unexpected point possible along the way. So it's even wrong to write a so-called chapter properly all the way to the end. And the biggest mistake is when an author writes a book all the way to the end. And in your relations to other people, it's actually quite a good thing to suddenly break off the connection. Melancholy is quite a beautiful condition. I fall into it quite easily and quite readily. Not too often, pretty much never when I'm in the country where I work, but right away when I'm in the city. There is no more beautiful place for me than here, and the melancholy I feel and always have. There are the city streets. There is the atmosphere of the city of studies, quite naturally. There are the ever unchanging sentences that people utter to me, probably the same ever unchanging sentences that I utter to those people. Quite a marvelous prerequisite for melancholy. I quite enjoy going to the cemeteries. I really revel in the inscriptions, in the names I recognize from earlier visits. Melancholy, when you walk into a shop and the same salesgirl whose movements 20 years ago were so incredibly brisk is now really slow. She slowly fills the bag with sugar. It's with a completely different movement that she picks up the money, shuts the cash drawer. The bell on the door makes the same sound, but it's melancholy. And this condition can last for weeks. And I think, perhaps for me, melancholy, this constant self-administration of melancholy in tablet form, is the ideal or the only effective medicine. There is always the non-existent conversation with my brother. There's the non-existent conversation with my mother. There's the equally non-existent conversation with my father. There's the non-existent conversation with the past, which itself no longer exists, which will never exist again. There's the conversation with the long, non-existent sentences. There's the dialogue with non-existent nature. Intercourse with concepts that are non-concepts, never could be concepts. Intercourse with conceptlessness,
cluelessness. The conversation with a material that doesn't answer back. The absolute soundlessness that ruins everything. The absolute despair from which you can no longer extricate yourself. There's the imaginary prospect that you have built up for yourself in order to be able to keep only imagining it. There's the attempt to brush up against objects that dissolve the moment you think you could have touched them. There's intercourse with actualities that turn out to be shams. There's the attempt to piece back together a period of time which was never unified. There's always the same groping in your imagination towards a representation of things that by its very nature must prove false. There's your identification with things that emerge out of sentences. And you know neither anything about sentences nor anything about things. And time and again, you pretty much know nothing at all. That is, of course, the quotidian element from which you must distance yourself. You have had to leave behind everything. Not to shut the door behind you, but to slam it shut and walk away.
How'd that feel?
Good. I had a nice thought of something at the end there that was helping me. So, yeah, good.